Good evening, everyone. Simon here from the Institute of Applied Psychology, and welcome to our NLP webinar on how to communicate with influence and integrity. Thanks for joining us tonight. You'll see a Q&A option on your screen. Feel free to ask any questions as we progress tonight, and we'll address as many of them as possible at the end. For now, I'm going to hand over to Gordon Young, our founder and lead trainer for tonight's webinar.
Thank you, Simon. So we start tonight. Our topic is how to communicate with influence and integrity. I want to thank you for joining us. Let's begin at the beginning. What we're doing here is a little taste test of what NLP can teach you in the realm of communication. NLP is a multi-dimensional approach, but one of the things it's famous for is the communication piece. Let me state my bias from the beginning. For me, it's not whether you should do NLP or not, it's who you should do it with. For me, if you are a parent, you should know NLP. If you want to be successful in life in a business sense, you should know NLP. If you just want to be a great partner or a great daughter, son, brother, whatever, anywhere where relationships are important, NLP is important. So why do I say that? Well, there was a time when I knew nothing about NLP. There was a time when I didn't know what those letters meant, and I had no interest in the space. Then I met a guy who changed my life, basically. He approached the world very differently to me. He seemed to have skills and knowledge that I simply didn't have. In fact, most of what he offered me was completely contradictory to what I believed about the world. And I was, considered by many people a relatively successful small business person, but ultimately in life, this guy showed me that I wasn't terribly successful at all, that I had a lot of things happening that were not ideal, not optimal, and that things could be improved. The thing was, I didn't know anyone else in my entire life that was optimal around the internal workings, around the voice that ran in my head, around things like stress, anxiety, procrastination, irritation, how to be more influential with people. I didn't know anything about that. But as you can see from this slide, I've learned. It is important that you know who you're listening to, because ultimately there's a lot of people out there claiming expertise, and there are people who have real runs on the board, and there are people who just have, creative marketing. So I've headed up a couple of different associations in the field, but probably the biggest point of difference between me and most people in the country, in fact, all people in the country who run schools, is that I'm the only person who went to the Milton Erickson Foundation in Phoenix, Arizona. You need a master's degree to even get an entry. And this was the birthplace of NLP. So in many ways, I have what I would deem to be the truer NLP from the source. My NLP is very different from other people's. And I think that is, this fact here is in fact the main reason why. So as the Institute of Applied Psychology, who you're now listening to, we've got many years' experience. We've had a number of graduates. We are a coaching company as well. We run corporate trainings. We're across different aspects of this NLP space. So what is NLP? Let's go to that. Well, NLP teaches you what the most effective people already know. NLP, in essence, was the model for success. So a lot of training in a lot of different fields actually uses elements of NLP. They don't necessarily state it explicitly, but they do use NLP. One of the problems with that, as I've discovered it, is that unless you have a fair bit of NLP background, just taking elements doesn't really make it work. It'd be like taking 3 or 4 elements out of a cake and thinking that you'll still get the same cake. And the answer is no, you won't. It just won't work the same way. And NLP is a bit like that. I'm going to say that NLP creates possibilities and is the fast track to success. A lot of people say to me that doing NLP training basically move them or progress them forward a decade in a couple of weeks. So where else is NLP strong? Well, Anthony Robbins is basically NLP trained. Bill Clinton is NLP trained. World leaders, political, business, financial, they're all well across NLP. In the areas of sport, Shelley Taylor-Smith, 7-time world marathon swimming champion, has been trained by us. Jeff Hugel, Olympic swimmer, has been trained by us. Shelley Oates, another local girl, and various rugby players are all across NLP. So for us, NLP is an experiential skills-based training, and it's about you. It's about how do people run their own mind? How does it work? What does their conditioning tell them? How do you work this and this, the heart and mind together? How does that work? And of course, when we're studying people, we're also studying ourselves. So here's a thought for you. A lot of people say, well, what can I get out of NLP? NLP is training your mind to be more effective. Your mind, particularly your unconscious mind, is actually the underpinning, the driving force behind all of your future success. A lot of people think it's their education or their intelligence. That's not true. If that were true, university professors would run the world, but they don't. The truth is it's your unconscious patterning that tends to make you successful or not. How do you manage situations when they're not optimal? How do you take an action when you don't feel like it? How do you make the best of a situation rather than letting yourself slide into the drama and the chaos and the irritations of things? So many people waste so much of their daily allocation of time by getting caught up in excessive thoughts about things or excessive dialogue around something. And the most effective people on the planet simply bypass all of that and focus on what they can do rather than what they can't. So why would you want to become a decent communicator? Well, why would you want to train in the space? A lot of people have told me over the years that they're already effective communicators. They'll say something like this, I don't need to train to talk. I know how to get out a sentence. I'm going to say that doesn't exactly make you an effective communicator. So it's one of those things that most people think they're pretty good at. But ultimately, how do you determine if you're effective as a communicator? It has to be the results you get. And a lot of time people don't realize just how much more influence they have if they have more communication tools. So one of the first myths of communication is that it's all about what you say. The truth is, it's not about what you say. It's about how it's going to land, right? You can throw something at someone, but whether they choose to catch it or not is a whole other thing. So the first myth is it's all about you and what you do and you just getting a sentence out in an articulate way. That's not really good communication. Great communicators actually read their audience. They start with the receiver in mind. If you want to be effective at influencing a situation, you need to ask yourself, how is what I'm about to say going to land with that person? How do I need to tailor my communication so that they feel it, hear it, see it, and it's going to have an impact on them? How do I do that? And that means your focal point is over there with them. It's not with you. Most people communicate from their own position. The truth is, you're not the one that needs to be convinced of this. You're not the one you're trying to influence in any way. You're already on board. But ultimately, it starts with you being able to step out of yourself and really put yourself in someone else's space. The other myth about communication is there's a personality thing. So you hear people talk about, oh, he's a natural communicator. Well, I'm going to say it can be learnt. That's the whole point of this. I was certainly not known for my communication skills before, but now, ultimately, people are willing to pay for me to come in and train their company on how to improve communication skills. The other big thing is that it's all about the words that you say. Actually, that's not true either. There is this myth that goes around, and it's in a lot of NLP training as well. I've seen it on TED Talks, this idea that there's been studies done that only 7% of any communication is the actual words you speak. Well, that's not true. I think the main point that often gets included in this is that there are things like gestures and tones. So the tone of your voice certainly influences the communication, and your physiology influences the communication. Those points are valid, but the exact numbers, not so sure about. Certainly the idea that only 7% of your communication is the words you use doesn't make a lot of sense. By definition, I could speak a foreign language to you and you'd get 93% of the communication. That's unlikely. So why would you want to be influential is the other big question. Sometimes people worry about, isn't that just being manipulative? Well, it kind of depends on context and intent. We're all seeking to be influential at times. If you're giving advice to someone, you're trying to help someone, you're seeking to be influential. It all comes down to that context and intent. For me, it becomes manipulative when the outcome is for you and it's not for them. If my intention is to help that person, maybe help that person get out of their own way, or it's at the very least a win-win arrangement, then I'm not convinced that's manipulative. We're all going to use the skill set we have to seek to influence. If you got children, you better influence them, because if you don't, someone else will. There's no such thing as a vacuum in nature. Ultimately, someone will fill that space. And if it's not you, you don't know who it will be. So ultimately, context and intent is the defining elements for me. When should you and when should you not? When do you not have permission to really seek to influence a situation? So, let me be clear. NLP can be used for manipulation. There are certainly some courses that you can find out there where manipulating people, it does not seem to be unethical in their view. Often they're around sales, sometimes they're around things like seduction. And there's no doubt that NLP can draw this sort of underground, slightly unsavory element. Thankfully for us, we don't see them in our courses. Those are the guys who are in their bedrooms doing it all online and looking for that kind of thing. There are certainly other schools and other courses that they're more attracted to than us. For us, selling someone something needs to be helping someone get something that they want, not selling them crap that they don't need or don't want or that they'll regret later. That's not a fair or reasonable use of NLP. But what I would say about this is, when I'm accused sometimes of NLP being manipulative, is that it is effective, which is why people will go and grab it and use it for evil intent. The truth is, NLP is not the problem. NLP is safe. NLP used appropriately is a wonderful tool, arguably among the best tools you'll ever find. So NLP is not evil, it's the intent that is. It's kind of like money. If I have money, I can either feed a village in Africa or I could pay someone to clear the village in Africa. Money's not the problem. It's my intent that's the problem. So I'm going to say the allegations about NLP actually show you that it's effective because people won't steal something that isn't effective. So what actually characterizes an influential communicator? That's a big question. Let me go through some ideas here. The first one is an effective communicator starts a conversation with purpose. You start with the end in mind. You also place yourself in the shoes of a listener, which I've already flagged, and you adjust your language to match the experience of the listener. So it's really important that you adjust. You come into a space and meet them where they are. You can talk in different terms, whether it's jargon or an education level that's different from the listener, or an age appropriate level. But ultimately, if you don't adjust, then ultimately the person will not respond. Good communicators build rapport easily. And when I say rapport, I'm effectively talking about trust here. They also tend to use devices like metaphor and specific purposeful language to support better outcomes. We'll talk about that in a moment. And they're great listeners. This is something that often is not talked about in NLP. And I've really taken this from where NLP came from, which is what I was taught at the Milton Erickson Foundation. The truth is, great listeners are great communicators because they actually know what you said. They're actually responding to the situation at hand. I'm also going to say that great communicators are empathetic. Now, again, you're not going to hear that word very often in NLP, but empathetic is the ability to recognize that something can look different to how it feels. A great communicator can attach themselves, or they can recognize how something might feel for someone else and know how to respond. And a great communicator knows how to read people, body language, their cognitive style, and something called the linguistic markers. A linguistic marker is in essence how the person shares unconsciously a lot of their cognitive processing, whether they lean towards optimism or pessimism, whether they recognize their responsibility in a situation or not, whether they lean towards avoidance, whether they're more kinesthetic, more visual, more auditory in their processing style. There are something called linguistic markers. And when I'm working with people, I'm coaching or I'm in clinic or I'm training, I'm listening out for the linguistic markers that give me an indicator of what's going on in there. Because your words actually give away your habitual cognitive processing styles. We can't talk too much about it here. That's a whole other piece and a much larger piece. But ultimately, your language tells people what's going on internally for you. So can you learn to do this? Yes, of course you can. It's not about being natural at anything. It's a skill set that can be learnt. So how? How would you do it? Well, ultimately, as I said before, an effective communicator begins with the end in mind. Even if you don't know much about NLP, you can do this. And that is, you can choose to be mindful. Ask yourself, before you start down the line of a communication piece, ask yourself, what outcome do I want out of this? What do I want to get out of this conversation? Because that's crucial. If you tackle a more crucial conversation or an emotionally driven conversation, if you don't cognitively, consciously, and deliberately choose your purpose, your emotions will. And unfortunately, when your emotions get involved, they nearly always redirect your purpose into showing that the other person has wronged you. It's pretty much translates into look what you've done to me. Look how I'm feeling now. And it comes down to a very childlike thing that we've done from early age, which is seek to guilt adults and other people around us into behaving in a way that we prefer. So, as a 2-year-old, you knew how to do that. You would guilt parents, siblings, etc., to make you, or to get something for you, to make something happen for you. We carry that on into adulthood without even realizing that we do it. But making someone feel guilty is not necessarily going to give the outcome, which might be, I want a different type of behavior here. I want a different outcome for us as a team. I want you to be more proactive. What is it that you want them to do? And then reverse engineer your communication to support that outcome. They also start by placing themselves in the shoes of the listener. So how do you read the listener? Well, people tell you a lot unconsciously about themselves. Even if you don't understand these linguistic markers, this is something you could look at. How are they dressed? What are their interests? What do they do for a living? Are they organized and neat, or are they lean towards being slightly sloppy, a bit kinesthetic? What mood are they in the moment that you're speaking to them? And what are they likely to want from the conversation? Because people are only ever listening out for what's in it for them. People are constantly filtering for what's relevant to them or what's going to benefit them. What are their strengths and all their weaknesses? And what kind of language does a listener use generally? If the listeners very rarely uses a word that's got more than 3 syllables in it, then your language will need to adjust in order to match and be something that they understand. It's referred to in the Ericksonian model as speaking their experiential language. If I have a client that walks through my door and they are constantly swearing about how their life is, then I know that I need to throw in some of that same language for them to feel connected, trusting, that they can relate to me. With someone else, you'll never hear me swear because ultimately that would be a rapport break. So ultimately, when you connect to someone, you build trust. But there's a lot people give away just by the way they present themselves. Let me also give you some very specific language pieces. Here's something that most people don't really realize. When you talk, you by definition force the listener to create pictures inside their head. The ways we process auditory information is we create images. If I suggested to you for a moment now that it'd be nice to be at the pub rather than be on this webinar, then you just got an image of a pub. Now, ultimately, I'm, by definition, kind of controlling those images. In fact, I'm really influencing, but sometimes it feels like it's kind of controlling it. So let me give you another example. If I suggested to you that just outside your door there was a clown juggling, a friendly clown, a non-threatening clown juggling, you'll notice that ultimately you've now got a clown in an adjoining room. You have spliced together your real life recollection of that room or that space, and you've mixed it up with a clown that I'm guessing is a fabrication. It might be an archetypal clown. It might be one you've only ever seen on images or posters or Cirque du Soleil or something, but ultimately that clown does not exist in that space. So your unconscious mind has this wonderful ability to create a fabrication and hook it straight into something that's real. This is the underpinning to all creativity. Unfortunately, it's also the underpinning to all anxiety, because you are fabricating that with the same wonderful level of creativity when you imagine that meeting next week going horribly pear-shaped. One of the things that's interesting, though, is despite the regular use of the word don't in our language, there is no such picture for don't. If I said to you now, don't think of the clown in the corridor and don't imagine yourself at the pub, you still have to do it and then try and pull back. Children are constantly told, don't do this and don't do that. We regularly actually implant an image of exactly what we don't want in someone else by using the word don't. Don't forget to pick this up on the way home. Or I've had a school call me and say, I don't want you to worry, don't panic, but there's been an accident. Now, the very first thing people tend to do when someone says don't panic, it immediately creates an angst within that person, because we can't process the word don't visually. So don't think of a blue tree. Don't imagine that clown riding a unicycle. You can't not. And one of the problems we've got with communication is if you implant a movie in someone's head, I mean, of course, you're not really doing it, they're doing it, but you are influencing it. If you implant a movie in their head, they're much more likely to go off that movie 2 hours from now when they've forgotten your instruction. They will go off that movie rather than your instruction. So you should always state exactly what you want. Don't run around the house with scissors is different from always walk when you're carrying scissors. Don't forget to pick this up on the way home, or don't forget to complete this by end of day is different from make sure you pick this up on the way home. Please remember to complete this before end of day. The deadline is urgent. So one of the keys to being effective as a communicator is understand the power of your own language. When you are actually talking, you are influencing the very thought patterns of your listeners. Another word that has some power to it is the word but. Now, but is often used as a softener. I love you, but. And then we talk about what we don't like. It's often used this way to soften supposedly a criticism. However, the trouble with it is it tends to actually negate everything you've said before. The moment there is a but in the middle of a sentence, it will tend to force the person to only wait and listen to and remember the second half of that sentence. I love you, but I don't like how untidy you are. There's only one thing you heard then. So the word but is massively overused. The other thing about it is it creates conflict. You know, you'll hear on the news, people say, a reporter will say, well, the Prime Minister said this, but the Leader of the Opposition said that. It's a either or type arrangement. If we did it differently, I love you and I just love it if you could be a little bit more tidy, please. That's a bit different. I've added in the and instead of the but. The Prime Minister said X, Y, Z. And the Leader of Opposition said this. It no longer has quite the same propensity to create conflict. The other thing, of course, you can do is add the negative last. I don't like how untidy you are, but I do love you. And now that's a softener. Let me offer you something else. One of the key factors that I talk about a lot is the key distinction or the pivot point of your life. And it's something I can share with you right now. Ultimately, we have something like 60,000 thoughts a day. Not all of them are terribly useful. A lot of them are basically crap, emotionally driven, magical thinking, irrational thoughts. But our life is determined by which thoughts and feelings we pay attention to and which ones we simply ignore. We have the capacity to ignore thoughts and feelings that don't serve us. Unfortunately, a lot of the time, people don't know how to ignore them when they are strong or loud. So people struggle with anxiety or procrastination or overwhelm or feeling stuck. They don't know how to ignore the voice that tells them that they're stuck or that they don't feel like it or that there's risk where there maybe isn't. We don't know how to do that typically. So I can tell you very directly that the mechanism you use to make that choice between what is useful and worth paying attention to and what isn't actually physically determines your life because it determines all behavior. But I could also give that to you metaphorically. So let me give it to you in metaphor, because metaphor is one way of creating imagery that sits in the brain much longer. I have people that I trained a decade ago who can still talk to me and remind me of a story I told them. Most of the average, facts, figures, key points of a course, they'll forget, but the metaphor, the stories, they'll remember. So this is not a news story or my story, but here it is. A young Native American boy goes to his grandfather, who's the chief of the village, and says, "Grandfather, I have this terrible problem. I have this conflict in my head. It's like two wolves in a running battle through the forest. And one wolf represents everything that I like about myself. My generosity, my courage, my love for my people, my love for my family. And the other wolf represents everything I don't like in myself. My greed, my anger, my excess, my frustrations, my self-criticism. And the trouble is, grandfather, is I don't know which one will win." And the grandfather simply says, "It's simple, my son. The one you choose to feed." Now, I've just made the same point two different ways. For some of you, the metaphor would have hit you right dead center in the chest. Some, that was quite interesting. Others would have preferred the direct, which thoughts and feelings you pay attention to, which ones do we ignore. The key point I'm making here is that ultimately, if I've got you in front of me as an individual or group, I need to know which one you're more likely to be able to take on board. Now, on average, is about 80% would prefer the metaphor, and about 10 to 20% are going to be happy with a direct statement. So another point about being an effective communicator is the ability to truly hear what's being said. A lot of people have poor listening styles, and I ask you to consider yours. For a lot of people, as they're listening, they're also formulating what they're going to say. In some cases, they're really only ever listening and waiting for a break so they can throw in what they want to say. Sometimes they don't even make a break. They'll just talk over the person. But a good listening style truly listens to everything the other person says before you respond. Ask yourself, check in with yourself, whether your listening style truly does that, or whether you actually don't really always pick up the last parts of a conversation. In some cases, some of you will actually feel like you're not terribly bright because you often misread instructions or you get things wrong. I'm going to say the likelihood is that you have a poor listening style, not that you're not capable. You just don't always listen all the way through. And I'm also going to say this element of being empathetic. I'm going to say the fastest way to build rapport with someone is to be interested in them, for you to know what people want to know, that they're heard, that they're understood, that they're recognized, that they're seen. When you're using NLP as a device, it doesn't work very well because people don't feel seen. People don't feel heard. I'm going to say, even though it's not standard NLP, certainly not in this country, that being empathetic and being truly interested in the person is crucial to being a great communicator. The way you influence is you show them that you're willing to step into their world for a period of time, not just operate from yours. And the truth is, you can learn from just about anyone. My 6-year-old teaches me things all the time because I'm truly listening. And the last piece is that good communicators can read body language and cognitive styles and linguistic markers. So what do you mean by cognitive styles? Well, people will fairly quickly show you whether they lean towards optimism or pessimism. That would determine to a large extent how you communicate something. To a pessimist, you want to talk about consequence and the avoidance of consequence. To an optimist, you want to talk about results and possibilities. If you talk results and possibilities to a pessimist, they're going to think you are in la la land, that you're delusional, that you're fluffy. If you talk in consequence and what we have to avoid to an optimist, they're going to look for another job. They don't want to be part of that. They're looking for possibility, not what could go wrong. So the cognitive style of the person, there are numerous different elements to this. I'm just showing you one option, is that it's really important that you actually can pick up from the person's language which way they lean. This is referred to as a meta program. But sometimes people can give it to you in the first 30 seconds. So it's important to be able to hear and truly hear. So that's our presentation, but I'm happy to take questions now. So Simon, have you got something there?
Absolutely. Just a reminder, everyone, there is a Q&A box where you can ask questions in your webinar screen. So the first question tonight, is there a difference in how I apply this at work and at home?
I'm going to say the short answer is no. There isn't a lot of difference in that, because ultimately it's still about reading. We often get lazy with people that we're more familiar with, and we don't want to or don't feel that we should have to be as cognizant of what we say. But I'm going to say every relationship, you're either building it or you're damaging it. There's no cruise controlling relationship. So ultimately, I think it's really important. Just because you're married to someone does not mean that you shouldn't know how to build a level of rapport before you have a serious conversation with them, or know how to frame something so they're much more willing or likely to come with you on something. Ultimately, you don't want to have to either fight or threaten constantly. It needs to be, how do I build collaboration? How do I build all of my relationships, personal or professional? And communication is one of the few things that we actually are in control of. One thing that I've learned so much from NLP is that we control so much more than we think we do. Whether it's our emotional state or the way we influence others, we control a lot more than we think we do. But it does start with you managing your own emotional state, because you can't run the patterns of a great communicator when you're busy being annoyed, frustrated, feeling like you've been slighted, you're angry or stressed. You just can't do it, because those emotions will hijack your purpose. They'll redirect what you want to communicate at that unconscious level, and that usually doesn't work for people. So the context is slightly different, but the principles are exactly the same. If you've got a teenager, you've got to find a way of stepping into their world and making them feel like you get it, just the same as you would with a stakeholder or a client. It's no different. Sometimes people think that the consequences are much more in a professional realm. I'm going to say a lot of the time, maybe they're not. We have the highest teen suicide rate in the world. This is an appalling statistic for us in Australia. Your ability to communicate to your teen is crucial. They're living a life that when you're a teen did not exist. Right? There is social media. There is cyberbullying. There's a whole bunch of things at play that when we were kids, it just didn't exist. So you have to find a way of ensuring that these kids know they can talk to you. One of the things that seems to be consistent is with kids who've attempted suicide, they felt they couldn't talk to anyone. But what they really mean is they didn't feel they could talk to anyone without feeling judged or to feel that they were burdening someone. They invariably do have people they could have talked to, but they didn't. So your ability to communicate, build rapport, and create those relationships is important across the board. There's no place on the planet where you as an individual can achieve greatly. You have to enlist people into your dream, into your enterprise, into your project. It can't all be done by you. So ultimately, one could argue that relationships you form in your life are going to be the most important thing. And my final piece on that is, it's just come out in my head now, is that I've lost my father and my sister. In both cases, what I realized more than most things, one of the biggest lessons, most notable factors here was what they accumulated has largely been dispersed to viddies and other places. So all the goods, the material things, were important to them, but not to anyone else. But what was notable about both of them is that the relationships they formed, the people who came from far and wide to say goodbye, that was notable. And throughout my life, relationships I've not really considered to be that important. This is not something I learned. But now, to me, it's very clear that these relationships are the lifeblood of my life. And they are for most people if they allow it to be. So how do you make sure you have fewer arguments and conflicts and misunderstandings? Learn how to be a good communicator. It's not just about influencing others, it's about influencing yourself too, because you've got to learn to communicate with yourself more effectively. If you're running a seriously critical internal dialogue, or you're in a lot of doubt, or you can't seem to take an action when you don't feel like it, or you keep taking an action despite the fact you know it's not a good thing to do, it might be drugs or alcohol, cigarettes or something, then you've got to learn to communicate with yourself more effectively. And this is something that NLP teaches. Simon.
Great answer to that one, Gordon. The final question for tonight. I'm looking to change my career. Would NLP be a good starting point?
Well, obviously it depends a little bit on what you want to do, but NLP opens up the door for all sorts of things. The big thing about it is that, well, let me give you my own experience. I started NLP without really knowing exactly why I was going to do it. I know I was massively anxious. I was suffering from panic attacks. So the first port of call for me was resolving my own stress. I was running a business with 34 staff and just not manage it very well. And one of the things that I really noticed was that nearly everyone else I knew who was running similar size enterprises was not managing it well either. So I didn't even think it was particularly unusual. I certainly didn't think there was anything wrong with me or that I wasn't managing things well. It was just part of the deal. You have that much outlay, that much pressure, you're going to be stressed. And then my father died of a heart attack. And I realized that I needed to do something different. And this is about the time that I met this NLP guy from overseas who really showed me a different way of being. And in essence, I first used NLP in a management sense. Then, when I started to get a little bit more into it, I started using it for my own self as well. I was doing that from the beginning, but in the professional sense, I was using the management sense, and it really made a big impact on how I was running my business. But then I decided to sell the business, and I came into being a consultant, a trainer, a coach, and a therapist. And all of those options are available through NLP because you've got a skill set. If you get good at it, not if you have a cursory understanding of it, but if you get good at it, then it's a skill set that people will pay you a fair bit of money to train them in, to coach them. It's a wonderful skill set and ultimately gives you a lot of freedom and a lot of variance if that's what you want. You know, a few weeks ago, I taught NLP master practitioner. Then I went to Melbourne. I taught a hypnosis class. I then flew to Perth and I was teaching communication and self-leadership. I came back. I taught an NLP master class, and I obviously was coaching people in between. That was in about 3 weeks. That kind of variance and variety is not easy to achieve. But with an NLP background, I can apply it to so many different places. And I like that. I don't want to just sit in a room with someone and work with them as a coach or a clinician. Just doing that, I think, would be a little bit tiresome. But being able to apply this model to all sorts of different areas of your life, because it's the one underpinning source of all truth, of all success. And that is, how does your brain work? When you can't manage that, or you can't make it optimal, then everything else turns to crap. So ultimately, having this skill set does allow you to go in different places. Some people decide to become coaches. Some people, switch into coaching roles within the company they're already in, or they move into the training and development space. There's a lot of variants that I see people do, and all sorts of different things. Some people create their own enterprise, and they're working only with parents because that's their interest. And they've all done the NLP training, but their application is so wide and so different. And I love watching that. I love watching people create something really special that no one else is doing, and they're all doing it out of the same training space, the same body of knowledge and skill. So can you do something with it? The answer is absolutely. In fact, if you want to, you can't not do something with it. It is something that you can apply virtually anywhere.
Thanks a lot, Gordon. That's all we've got time for tonight. Thank you for attending the webinar. Look out in your email for a link to the recording very soon, and we will catch you again at our next webinar in January. Thank you very much.